If you know anything about the history of film, you're probably familiar with this image from Safety Last, released in 1923. Coming at the silent comedy's climax, with Harold Lloyd forced up the side of a tall building in an act of half-hearted daredevilry, the sequence is so expertly designed, balancing rising tension with slapstick comedy, that we don't notice directors Fred Neumeier and Sam Taylor violating the basic laws of our universe. Lloyd was an accomplished stuntman, but most of the scene was actually filmed using multiple segments of facade on top of a series of variously tall buildings, giving the illusion of one continuous, increasingly dangerous ascent. But space isn't the only thing being messed with here. Everything moves just a bit too fast in a movie from the silent era, though actually nothing moves at all. The very movement of moving pictures is an illusion, and one we're all too familiar with. Early films were shot on average at 16 frames per second, depending on the speed at which the camera operator manually turned the crank, while modern projections tend to play the film back at 24 frames per second. When Lloyd yanks the clock from its base, it's as if we're being reminded that film, by its very nature, pulls time itself out of joint. On film, time is a pliable material. It allows us to take an image from one event, one specific location in space-time, and connect it with another, even blending them together in a single visual to construct stories and spectacles previously thought impossible beyond our imaginations. But by innovating what we can see, it also fundamentally impacts how we see. Across the past few videos, we've seen how art in different forms can alter our experience of time as we consume it, from the pulse-altering power of music to the stasis of literature and painting. But film exists in its own dimension, touching everything from philosophy to politics, and forcing us to reconsider just what it is to exist in time. Since the earliest picture shows, we've had a hard time separating the world of the screen from our own. That's if you do believe the infamous rumour about the debut of the Lumiere brothers short The Train Arrives at the Station, which apparently had its first audience screaming in terror at the prospect of the train bursting through the screen. Had the film been projected at fewer frames per second, dipping below the illusion's estimated threshold of 12 frames, it's unlikely whatever effect it had would have been so extreme. Our eyes don't see things in frames, of course. Though 60 frames per second is usually given as the maximum noticeable speed of video, how we process visual data relies on the constant firing of electrical signals at unknown frequencies. But despite the fundamentally different ways of seeing between the camera and the eye, cinema helped to fuse the two in our collective imagination. The French philosopher Henri Bergson, who I briefly mentioned in the last video, but has cast a large shadow over most of this topic, talked about the cinematographical mechanism of thought. Bergson was interested in becoming, the sense of reality as a continually evolving process that was never fixed, changing qualitatively rather than quantitatively. In other words, not divisible into stages or units, but in a constant state of flux. This, he argued, is how we perceive time, a constant stream of ever-evolving sensation. But whenever we try to think about this kind of reality, to describe it, we perceive only states, of duration only instants. This method of thinking was a helpful shorthand, he accepted, but an inadequate representation of how time felt, a problem that film only exacerbated. Film was still in its infancy when Bergson was writing, but it had already asserted itself as a powerful new model for experience. Bergson argued that where we once imagined reality as a series of static snapshots only in abstract, film now presented us with a visible reinforcement of the illusion we should be challenging. By seeing frames, we think in frames. In the early days of film production, this somewhat stilted representation of time was backed up by editing practices. When it came to putting a film together, editors for a time could only envisage what they were working with through static images, manually cutting and pasting sections of film reel together, later to be brought to life by the projector. As a result, film editing essentially served the purpose of providing bare-bones continuity, with an infrequent cut between shots intended to be as inconspicuous as the jolt from one frame to the next, in order to preserve the illusion that a film captured one naturally continuous experience, as the very first films had depicted only individual moments, like a kiss or a sneeze. But Bergson's analysis of our cinematic attitude towards time couldn't anticipate just where film was going. In 1924, Douglas Fairbanks Studios bought a moviola, a device invented by the Dutch-American engineer Ivan Serurier. Initially conceived of as a home projector, The moviola was adapted to meet the needs of editors, allowing them to view the film in action as they edited. Now, the edited time of the film reel could be observed in near real time, not only speeding up the editor's workflow, but further blurring the distinction between felt time and filmed time. Ironically, the propensity to envisage film as reality didn't necessarily promote a more naturalistic style of editing. In the early days of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin having declared cinema to be the most important of all the arts, a lot of time and money was spent trying to establish an artistic industry that could rival Hollywood. Building on the theoretical momentum initiated by Lev Kuleshov, who had experimented with the suggestive power of editing to implicitly communicate certain ideas or emotions, film was studied as an academic discipline, with editing at its centre, largely out of necessity, as restrictions on trade had led to a shortage in film stock. Consequently, film students took to re-editing pre-existing films, usually imported from America. This practice helped to crystallise what became known as the Soviet montage school, famously propagated by the director and theorist Sergei Eisenstein. For Eisenstein, almost more important than the visual content of the film was the cut itself. In his essay on A Dialectic Approach to Film Form, he talks about the essence of art as conflict, with a dynamic creative force arising from the combination of two opposing elements. In conventional editing up to that point, a cut was meant to emphasise similarity between shots, preserving the spatial and temporal logic of the scene. In contrast, forms of montage, utilising quick, aggressive, often surprising juxtapositions of images, created an aesthetic of conflicting visuals, which unlocked something more dynamic and energising for the viewer. Crucially, Eisenstein's championing of this style distinguished film as a medium of art, of artifice, rather than just a naturalistic reproduction of reality as it presented itself in newsreels and early documentaries, known as actualities. But while the continuity of reality, what Bergson viewed as perpetual becoming, is disrupted, chopped and changed in the edit, the dynamism of how we experience reality is enhanced. In this way, Eisenstein envisioned film as something akin to literary language. In the previous video, we explored how unbroken sections of language, which one would assume to best simulate the flow of time, actually evoke stillness. It's the intervention of paragraph breaks, the way we divide text up into smaller units, that creates forward momentum. Up there with the most effective examples of cutting's temporal power is Dziga Vertov's documentary Man with a Movie Camera from 1929. On the surface, it's a film about modern life in the Soviet Union. We see practically the whole gamut of experience, from birth to death, work and play, young and old. In other words, life as it is, which Vertov believed to be the only worthy subject of film. On the other hand, as its title indicates, it's a film about filmmaking. Eisenstein said art is the intersection of nature and industry. Vertov's film is built around this dualism, presenting filmmaking as both an act of creativity and of labour. It's apparently set in one day, though its scattergun approach to continuity, with frequent cross-cutting between settings and subjects, makes it hard to identify a clear timeline. What we do get is a vivid sense of time passing. A lot of time, in fact, with the assorted footage being recorded over a span of about 3 years. Crucially, this condensation of time isn't hidden from us. Not only does the style of montage bring the artifice of the cut to the foreground, Vertov's camera lets us witness this process taking place firsthand. About 20 minutes in, time stops. We're presented with a series of freeze frames, before suddenly seeing them in context, strung up in the office of the film's editor, Elizaveta Svilova, who's working on the film before our very eyes. It's a moment of pure Eisensteinian dynamism, a point of conflict between felt and filmed time, as production and product are brought into sequence. Eisenstein elaborated on his definition of dynamism, relating it to the malleability of the space-time continuum. In this sense, film editing allows disparate places and events to be collapsed, superimposed on one another, in the fourth dimension of film. The final few minutes of Man with a Movie Camera takes this a step further in this shot. Look familiar? Christopher Nolan's fascination with the bending of space-time, in both physics and psychology, seems to work in parallel with his fascination with cinema itself. Like Harold Lloyd constructing a single tall building from multiple film locations, Interstellar collapses distant moments in space and time together, not just in the story, but in the way the story is constructed. particularly in the sequence where Dr. Mann's betrayal is intercut with the burning of the family farm all the way back on Earth. If editing can impose continuity between shots from completely separate moments and locations, then, at least on film, we can take the continuum of space-time into our own hands. But the editing of time isn't only the domain of science fiction and art theory. It's something we do constantly, building our lives out of activities and routines which we establish through segmenting our experience. This doesn't just aid our memory of past moments, it influences our perception of the present. Research suggests that when approaching the end of a chapter or a clearly defined period of time in a book, our reading speed slows down, while the more segments an activity is split into, the more time we often feel has elapsed. Because not all periods of time feel the same, we judge them according to how much attention they demanded, assigning them value. For example, look at time spent awake and asleep. In an unconscious state, our perception of time shifts gears as we dream and consolidate memories, but our inability to act in and perceive the world around us can make this time feel inconsequential to our experience as a whole. Birth presents a similar issue. Our biology is virtually no different in our final moments in the womb, but as soon as we're born, taking our first breaths, we mark the starting date on our personal calendars. Then of course, there's work and leisure, time spent on and off the clock. These binaries define our temporal experience, and crucially, they're all depicted in Man with a Movie Camera, brought into conflict through the aesthetic of montage. Of course, the film itself sits between two classifications of time, as an object of work and of leisure. But this particular division of time is not as clear-cut as we like to think. Going to the cinema from the 1920s onwards was far and away the most popular commercial leisure activity. But while many saw it as a leap forward for both artistic culture and industry, others were fearful of its power and influence, as the biggest production companies were often subsidiaries of the state, like Germany's UFA and the Soviet Union's Mosfilm. Not only was the power of film as a medium for propaganda quickly and effectively realised, the very act of spending time at the cinema was arguably of political interest. The German theorists Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer had settled in the United States during the Nazi regime. They'd seen the German film industry, once home to the frequently transgressive work of German expressionist filmmakers, turn into a tool of fascist ideology under the watch of Joseph Goebbels, guiding and shaping the beliefs of the masses. To voice their anxiety towards what they termed the culture industry, the state-sponsored mass production of art and entertainment, in 1947 they published a joint work, The Dialectic of Enlightenment. Just as Bergson had been sceptical of the model of perception provided by the cinema, Adorno and Horkheimer noted how movies tended to reproduce empirical objects from the real world in order to give the impression that the outside world is the straightforward continuation of that presented on the screen. For them, film isn't an escape from reality, a clearly demarcated outlet from our daily lives. It's merely a way of occupying men's senses from the time they leave the factory in the evening to the time they clock in again the next morning. Stepping into the darkness of the screening room in your time off is actually a necessary continuation of your work life from earlier in the day. The idea of a work-life balance is, for Adorno and Horkheimer, a myth of the bourgeois, who maintain the illusion of boundaries in their personal time, while in reality their entire being is in the service of the state. The same can be said of commercials. When watching TV, YouTube, or even movies on streaming platforms, we get to an ad break, but it's all part of a single viewing experience, occupying our time all the same, and serving the overall interest of the broadcaster, which is that we keep watching, spending our time, which is our money. Even the liberating cuts of montage can't save us. For Adorno, the radicalism of montage as a way to rebel against the illusion of continuity ultimately lost its edge, as its creative cutaways were soon canonised within the conventional language of editing, ironically being accepted by viewers as yet another way of depicting the flow of reality on film. In Adorno and Horkheimer's theory of the cinema, we see Bergson's fears take on a socio-political dimension. In an industrialised society, where art and entertainment are cogs enmeshed in a global machine, the myth of time as a discontinuous series of states and instants serves to mask and make bearable the underlying and overwhelming motion of the modern world. That feeling must have resonated with Dziga Vertov, born David Kaufman, whose chosen name translates to spinning top. His film is littered with images of cyclical motion, from tumbling water in a reservoir to a worker's spinning wheel, and of course to the turning reels of the projector, conflated in montage to symbolise the literal revolution of modern society. But then we get this, a shop window dummy pedalling a bike. Except it's not. The bike, motor-powered, is pedalling the dummy. The order of movement has been reversed. Our relationship with cinema started off with hand-cranked cameras, hand-edited reels, which animated its temporality. Now, film turns us. A weekly trip to the cinema has been ousted by at least hourly visits to YouTube, TikTok, or even just seeing digital billboards on the street. At a global level, we're getting closer to spending over half our waking moments watching movement on a screen. When you think about how pervasive film has become, how much time it now occupies, we as viewers look increasingly like that dummy on the bike, matching our movements to the artificial flow of frames. I think there's something to be said also about the technological evolution of moving pictures. The graduation from film to video isn't just a transition from physical to digital media. Film as a noun describes what we watch, the material passing in front of the projector, which is chopped up into flickers by a rotating shutter. But video, which encompasses all recorded visual content, describes how we see. It's a subtle linguistic shift, but I think it speaks to the massive perceptual and cultural change that we've experienced. Giving a shape to time in art, as we've seen, helps us stake a claim to the transience of our temporal experience. But a shape can easily become a mould. To construct continuity in cinema, film, video, by linking images in the edit, is also to deconstruct continuity as we feel it, as every cut that brings two shots together also splits a reel of film apart. That cut can be a liberation from the monotony of time, or just another link in the chains that restrict our behaviour through habit. That much is up to you. Film may well fool us into a false impression of time, as Bergson argues, if we can ever truly come to a right one. But illusions don't stop working when we know how they work. As long as we see Harold Lloyd scaling that facade, and not a disjointed series of still images taken in various places over 100 years ago, then time is whatever the director, the camera, the projector, and the eye make of it. Thanks for watching this third and final part of my series on time and art. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing, leaving a comment to share your thoughts, and checking out my other work, especially the previous videos in the series if you haven't seen them already. If you'd like to support what I do, then do head over to my Patreon, where you can get early access to uploads as well as behind the scenes updates and reflections on future videos. Thanks again for watching.